Are you ready to become a change maker? Our 48-week postgraduate program in public policy or the PGP may be just the thing for you. This hybrid program is designed to give you both the theoretical foundation and hands-on experience needed to excel in policy making. With a mix of expert-led webinars, in-person workshops, and policy simulation exercises, you'll gain real-world skills along with personalized mentorship. Through our policy programs, we connect good people to good ideas and good networks. Apply now at the link in the description to make an impact.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to All Things Policy. Now, you might have wondered how AI is being governed currently. What are the different states doing? What are companies doing? And what's going on at all these AI summits that are happening all across the world? So we are working on a report that presents the state of AI governance across all of these dimensions. And what we're going to do today is give you a sneak peek into that report. So my name is Bharath Reddy, and I have with me my colleague Rijesh Panicker. So welcome, Rijesh. And so to start off with, why do we need to do such a report, and how are we going about it? Can you just talk about the framework that we're using, and then we can get into different parts of the report?
So let's start with the why we felt the need for such a report. We've obviously been looking at AI governance for a while now, trying to think about what policies India should do and what the rest of the world is doing. And as we were looking at all of that, what we noticed is that there are a lot of sites and a lot of places, a lot of studies done about who is doing what laws and what these laws are, what is the timeline, what are the key aspects of it. Nobody's actually looked at governance across some kind of a standardized framework that sort of matters and looked at what is the actual difference, right? So we thought we would do that. So that was the main reason for doing this report. It's also nice to have one place. And this is going to be an annual report, and this is the first iteration of this report. So, hopefully we'll only improve our framework as we go forward. So this is like one single place where you can get a feel for how is AI governance different across different regions, across some major dimensions, and we can just talk about that as we describe the framework. And then hopefully over time, we can show you what are those changes across those different, have things improved, have things fallen off. And we're doing this for governments. We're doing this for multilateral organizations, and we're also doing it at the level of companies. In the case of companies, obviously not laws, but their principles and what are the changes in their principles. So that's basically it. In terms of a framework, maybe you can also pitch in on this, Bharat. Basically, it's a simple framework around 5 dimensions. Essentially, we've pulled together the laws that are in place or proposed across all these regions, and we've sort of slotted how those laws impact 5 key dimensions, which is transparency and accountability, how these laws are promoting innovation, are these laws taking geopolitical considerations into effect when they do these laws, what is each state doing in terms of improving its capacity to govern AI in its own space. And finally, focus on societal well-being. And, Bharat, maybe you can talk in a little bit more detail about what each of these dimensions are.
So, I think the reason why we started looking at all of these dimensions is, firstly, when we think of AI governance, a common understanding is that it's largely to do with minimizing risks or harms from adoption of AI. But when you look at what different states are doing, that's a really important part, but a lot of the efforts are actually directed towards how do you promote innovation in AI, or how do you address geopolitical considerations. So there are export controls being introduced on different parts of the AI value chain, say on how chips can be accessed, or how models can be adopted, or disclosure requirements about who's using these models, things like that. Geopolitical considerations. So, and there's a lot of efforts to promote innovation in the sense that there are a lot of investment in sovereign AI compute. There's investments towards building open and accessible or foundational models, or models that address local use cases as India is doing. So in all of these kind of things, you see that there are these different dimensions that are being tackled, and different states have these kind of priorities. So it's useful to look at what are these different priorities, and how do they compare against each other. So usually you hear that the US has a pro-innovation approach, and the EU has a more of a protection of individual
Yeah,
rights,
protectionist. Yeah, pro
right? So
safety,
yeah,
more
safety and
centralized approach.
individual
Yeah.
right approach. So, but beyond that, you'll see that there are a lot of dimensions on which these countries are actually taking these efforts, and the kind of efforts that they can take also depends on the kind of capabilities they already possess. And so we thought it'll be useful to compare against on all of these dimensions to get a good idea about what different states are doing.
But what's interesting about these dimensions is also that they each actually look at it from a different angle, right? So transparency and accountability is about the models themselves, the process of AI development, and what regulations should that process have to bring about safety and all of those other things. Promotion of innovation is about how will this help the economy. So it's more of an economic angle. Geopolitical considerations is almost game theoretic. It's actually looking at, has a region thought about what other regions are doing, how that impacts us, and therefore what regulations we need to bring, right? State capacity to governance is about internal stuff, as in what is the state thinking in terms of what do I need to build to govern successfully. And societal well-being is your standard. How does this impact civil society? Your the cognitive autonomy and all of those things. And so it's actually five very different dimensions, and it's kind of nice that we managed to pull this together in a single sort of a framework, and the way we represented it and all of that. So,
Right. So we'll get on to the first part of how we have structured this report, which is comparing the efforts by different states on how they are regulating or governing AI. So to start off with the US, so like we were discussing, there's a pro-market regulatory environment, and also a lot of geopolitical considerations to maintain their competitive advantage. So can you tell us a little bit more about what the US is doing along these different dimensions?
right. So, as you said, the US is mostly, because they are already leaders in the space. So, and clearly it's because it's mostly driven by the private industry. In many ways, regulation in the US is catching up to what private players have already done. So it's heavily focused on innovation and geopolitical considerations, which is to maintain the leadership. The third angle where we found they were doing quite well was around building their own capacity to govern. Now, the interesting thing in the US, of course, is that most of the things that the US did over the last year or the last couple of years was driven by President Biden's executive orders around AI safety and AI leadership. Now that has, of course, been revoked. So, and President Trump has brought about his own executive order, and so we don't know how this new executive order impacts some of the things that the previous executive order does. This is something that we expect will play out this year. But I still think that if you read carefully through what President Trump has written, he's essentially asked them to look at places around if there are any ideological biases that have come about because of the previous executive order, and so on and so forth. So he hasn't actually tried to do anything that's negative to innovation. So I don't really see that the places where they score high today, which is promotion, innovation, geopolitical considerations, I don't think that will actually go down. If anything, that might get strengthened. The state capacity to govern aspect of it, which we have essentially listed as internal efforts within the federal government to build their ability to regulate, that is the one area where I don't really know what will happen this year once President Trump's the reforms go through. So that will be interesting to watch. But essentially, yeah, it's just these two executive orders that have done most of it. The very interesting thing in the US that I saw was that societal well-being aspect of it, right? We're looking at risk, safety, misinformation, disinformation. Most of it has not actually happened at the federal level. There is an NIST framework that broadly for companies, and that's actually voluntary as a standard. But it's the states, Texas, Florida, California, Ohio, Colorado, all the big states. They are the ones who've actually jumped into solving for societal well-being, transparency, risk. So there are already several laws in place across many states saying you can't use AI for misinformation. You have to label generated data properly. You can't use it for electioneering and all of that stuff. So that's kind of another interesting schism, if you will, in the US, right? The federal government is very innovation focused, and the states are the ones looking at societal well-being, and maybe some amount of transparency. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out in the future.
And there's also this AI action plan that President Trump has proposed, that they'll be coming up with measures that will safeguard US dominance in this space and stay competitive and ahead of their rivals, right? So that's something that's also expected to happen. And
It is, but I mean, I think that is going to be an extension of his broad plan on, America first and dominance. And I don't know. I mean, I almost sometimes feel he might use it as a negotiating chip for us. Somebody gives leeway on tariff, they might get some exemption somewhere else.
Right.
It could be that too. But I think it's just a broader thing that he's pushing. So it'll be interesting to see how it plays out. Right? How does the rest of the world react to it?
Right. And when you're talking about the different states actually taking the lead on societal well-being and protecting that, an interesting observation I had was when Trump had invited comments for the AI action plan. So some of the companies had actually said that they would like to see the federal legislations to be the ones that are regulating it, and the states should not create this fragmented kind of a regulatory system, because that will make compliance harder. It will reduce their innovativeness, and then the Chinese models will catch up, and that's something that they're asking for. So you can see how that's a concern for companies that are building these things as well.
Yeah, that it is likely to be, because with the problem with the state level laws, just like in India, is that there will be variances in the level to which things are being enforced. Right, some states like California may be very pro consumer, and their laws will be very stringent, and then other places will be very lax. So then, as a company, it becomes a problem. The flip side to that, of course, is that a company might just decide that we'll comply with the strictest law out there in the state, and then we are compliant with everybody else. But it's always a gamble. So yeah, I can see why companies want it at a federal level.
So now, when you compare this with the EU, so the EU has a very comprehensive regulatory framework that looks at transparency, accountability, protection of individual rights, and they do a lot of things to promote that. So a lot of measures, such as having a risk-based tiering of AI systems. So they have unacceptable risk, high risk, limited risk, and minimal risk. And there are different compliance requirements for each of these risk levels. So they also have some of these requirements are related to evaluation and performance requirements, disclosures, licensing penalties, a whole range of things, right? So, and I think it'll also take a lot of effort to actually see that these are implemented, and putting this kind of a system in place will require a lot of state capacity to enforce as well. So you see that all of these kind of promote societal well-being, promote transparency, accountability, but they might also be kind of a barrier to innovation in some sense. But on the other hand, there are a couple of initiatives which are trying to invest a lot of funds into creating what they're calling gigafactories, AI gigafactories, which are like basically huge data centers, which are going to be used for building open, collaborative, complex AI models. Right? So a lot of investments towards that. And the path that the EU seems to be taking is preferring open source models so that they have some strategic autonomy, so that it's a collaborative kind of effort, and you have some continued access because of that. So that's something that's being done. So that's also addressing some of the geopolitical concerns. So all of these, another part of the geopolitical consideration efforts are the CHIPS Act in the EU, which aims to build a semiconductor ecosystem, ensure that they have address any vulnerabilities that they might be there in that value chain. So ensuring access to chips and having access to different models, and of the really capable models which are open and so that's broadly what the EU is doing. So when you look at that, how does it compare with China, what they're doing?
Well, actually, before we move on to China, I wanted to say there's two things I found very interesting about the EU's approach. One is, that we just spoke about how in the US companies are saying that, just give us federal laws. We don't want state and federal laws, right? If you really look at how the US has done it, they've leaned very heavily into leveraging so many of the other rules. It's not just at the EU level. in many of their, even in the EU AI Act or in the Digital Markets Act, they have specifically leaned in and said, look, this is just a broad framework. If any country wants to change it, add its own stuff, please feel free to do so. So, it's very anti-innovation in that sense. They've gone out of their way to make it a complex web of different kinds of things, right? And the other thing was that the risk focus in the EU is enormously high compared to the US, which I found very interesting. The whole three levels of risk, the tiering of risk, the very specific identification of things like facial recognition or using AI for hiring as very high risk things that the EU will decide not to allow for their people across all European countries. You don't see any of those things in the US. Maybe a sectoral regulator might have some limited things, but none of the federal laws, they may broadly say that we don't want discrimination, all that. But this level of detail in what is high risk and how that is just something very clear actually.
Right.
So that's one, which was a very interesting difference between the EU but then this has always been the difference that we've seen between the EU's approach and the US approach.
But there's also this question about, even though there is this very comprehensive regulatory framework, will the rules or all these penalties to enforce them, and they've not kicked in yet. And when it is time, maybe they will step back a little bit because they see that it's hindering innovation and they don't want to really do that. So that's something we need to wait and watch to see how much of these will actually be enforced when these different parts of the...
Correct. Exactly. Yeah. And the interesting thing there also is that if you really look within the EU outside of Mistral, there isn't really a big AI player. Although, funnily enough, they're also an open source sort of open AI player. So essentially, all of these rules that you're making has to still attract the attention of all the large players like Anthropic, OpenAI, or Microsoft. They all need to decide that these rules are worth it and they still want to come and play in the EU, right? So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out for them. Anyway. Okay, so China. So as usual, China is a interesting case. We we had to do our readings through a lot of translated documents. So take what we are saying with a pinch of salt, I guess. We don't know if this is actually true or not, but we think it is for the most part. The Chinese focus, again, has been predominantly on promoting innovation and on building their own capacity to govern. They are obviously, they have no option but to be aware of geopolitical considerations because it is mostly being drawn up to stop them right now. So, there's no way around it for them. What was interesting was that we did see a lot of rules that are focused on societal well-being or transparency, you might say, which I found quite interesting. But just going back to the innovation piece first, there's a lot of work going on in the innovation space. China has spent is putting together a lot of funds, directing a lot of funds to build their own chips, their own models across the board, right? They're spending a lot of money. I forget the number, it's some $300-400 billion of funding by the Bank of China, government VC funds, all of that. And all of it centrally planned, obviously, centrally monitored and governed. So it's kind of comprehensive the way they're trying to go about building AI. And, the example of DeepSeek shows that surprisingly, it's not just the large so-called centrally favored firms that are doing innovation in China, right? Even not unknown in the AI space, but relatively unknown outside the AI space. Companies like DeepSeek have come out and done some serious innovation there. We don't know the level of support they have from the government, but I'm sure they will in the future, but we don't know what support they had in the past. So clearly innovation is a big focus and innovation is happening in China. I found it interesting, like I was saying, the societal well-being piece and the state capacity to govern piece are both things that they've done quite a bit on. We came across a lot of rules on data privacy, content moderation, discrimination, user consent, users' ability to opt out. We found a lot of those things, labeling for AI-generated content, which is kind of nice. So clearly the Chinese government is thinking about, how do all these AI models come in and impact how society, what impacts it has on civil society. One would assume that there is also the concern that, this could be used as a tool against the state itself, which is obviously something of great concern for the CCP. So maybe that is why there's so much of it's slightly counterintuitive, but maybe that is why there is so much of consumer protection already in China, because it also helps the party if the people can be helped in that way, right? So yeah, so that's broadly what I think we saw about China. Was there anything else you wanted to add on the Chinese piece?
No, just in the last bit about how controlling that information ecosystem and how that could be a threat to narrative control and all of these things, right? So that's a existential risk in some sense. So I think that makes it really important to build those safeguards to ensure that these models are not seeing anything that goes against the
Yeah, but one might argue that that is an existential risk for every country, not just China, right? So it is perhaps the reason why the Chinese are more focused on that is because they're also very well aware of what happens when narrative control is taken or lost. So
right.
maybe that.
So, and in some sense, when you look at India, right? So it's the last of the countries that we have looked at. So broadly, we have looked at US, EU, China, and India, and these are the countries that we picked or regions that we picked because we thought they're the most.
Well, they are the three biggest regions that have influence on AI regulation and AI development, and India
India is
because
is of interest to us, so that's why we're looking at these different countries and regions. So in India, it's largely a light touch regulatory environment so far. So we're looking at creating more or less. There's a few sectors in which there are sector specific guidelines like finance and health, and but largely it's self-regulation that's at this point. So there are some guidelines in the recently released AI governance guidelines, basically asking for voluntary disclosures and voluntary incident reporting, but beyond that there's not too much that is prescribed in terms of regulation. But when it comes to innovation and geopolitical considerations, there's the India AI mission, which has these 7 pillars under it, and it goes about building domestic computing infrastructure. It looks at creating Indian data sets. So the AI Kosha, which is the data sets platform, has been launched recently. The India AI Compute Portal also has been launched recently, and there's also a startup pillar which is trying to fund startups working on priority areas. The priority areas for that they have identified as part of this are agriculture, education, and healthcare. So these priority areas, and they're trying to promote innovation, create data sets around these areas.
yeah, India specific solutions or
Yeah, and the compute is also preferentially allocated to these different areas. So while all of this is being done, there are, I think, you can see that some parts of this are also motivated by geopolitical considerations. That what if you lose access to chips? So you need to have some domestic computing capability, or you need to have access to some domestic indigenous models so that you can continue to have do what you want with them in those things. But maybe these are, if you look at the scale at which others are tackling this problem, India's efforts might build some
base level capacity. Yeah.
but it might not be able to compete in terms of capabilities on par with the frontier AI models. But then again, India has a few other interesting advantages in terms of the India stack, which might give you a lot of integration with different data sets or different use cases that might be possible because of that. So there are some other advantages because of the scale at which India works. Maybe you have some advantage as a market of that kind of size, right? So some advantages there. But yeah, any other comments on India that you?
Well, yeah, I mean, just reiterating the point around light touch regulation, right? It's a bit of a pleasant surprise actually that MeitY has gone with such a light touch regulation, right? Because if you really think about the conversations around AI, it's mostly about loss of jobs and unemployment and all of that. So in India, this should obviously be a matter of great concern. And despite that, I mean, I would argue that there are no stringent guidelines. There's no, they haven't really talked too much. I mean, there is conversation around what might happen when AI comes in, but by and large, I think the Indian state has taken the move that this is going to be a net positive for society, and we should push innovation in the space right now, which I think is the right approach for India. So, it's kind of pleasant surprise to see that happening, right? I would have assumed that jobs might have been the more bigger concern. So,
Right. No, but I think there is when you see different innovation happening at the scale, and you can't hold back innovation.
You can't hold that exactly.
You
Yeah, I mean,
need
like
to
you
address
have
both
to.
of these concerns together. It's not that you need innovation and you need to address the job problem as well. So stopping one is going to leave you behind in both of these.
Both the cases, exactly. Yeah.
So that's about what different states are doing. And the other area that we have looked at is companies. So what are companies doing in how they are proactively establishing principles or guardrails in how they build or use AI systems. So some of these initiatives go beyond what is strictly expected in terms of where they're operating and what they're expected to do. But they maybe are doing this because they want to build user trust in how they are operating and get more adoption or get declare how they're going about this thing, so that there's some responsibility in and how they build it, and also how users expect them to use their data or use the kind of things that they're doing with it, right? So broadly, what we have looked at is principles across these different companies that we have shortlisted, the risk mitigation efforts that they're doing, transparency and reporting guidelines, governance structure in terms of the roles that they've identified, responsibilities, ethics committees, and so on. And lastly, third-party oversight. So how open are they to scrutiny from outside parties? So it's not, while all of these measures are there in different companies to different extents, it's really not clear to what extent they're being enforced or how standardized these are. There is no standardization across these different companies and how they report it. And even the enforcement might not be as per what they claim that their principles are, and or the different guidelines that they've set for themselves, right? So those things are not very clear. But in terms of these different companies, any company that stands out for you in any of these parameters that you would like to
Well,
highlight?
of the lot that we've covered, I think clearly Anthropic is the one that stands out, right? Because they've always been a frontier AI lab that was set up to make sure that we get to AGI safely. And if you look at all of the concern around Claude not being released on time and it lagging behind the other, I think that basically shows that they've been very, very focused on their safety aspects of it. And if you read through the report, you'll see that Anthropic, in fact, does say a lot more about how they treat risk mitigation or transparency. They're one of the few that actually works extensively with third-party folks, to make sure the oversight is good. So Anthropic is sort of a standout, but I also broadly say that as we were discussing right at the beginning when we spoke about the US, the fact is that companies were front-running the governments in terms of building AI models. So naturally, a lot of these voluntary things came in because there was a vacuum. There was concern around unregulated development, and so companies came up with their own self-regulated standards. So we should expect that as government regulations kick in across the world, that there will be some standardization in the principles that are espoused by companies and the regulations that are demanded by governments. So I think over the next year we'll see them sort of come close together. What might be interesting is one would expect that companies are always going to be ahead of state regulations because they're further ahead in the innovation cycle. So they are, maybe one way to think about it is to identify gaps for us in this report on an ongoing basis, is to say, are companies dropping some principles and adding some new tests, new things that they want to look at? And that tells you where the gaps are, right? Things that are not being looked at by governments. So that might be an interesting thing to take away from the company's report, piece of this report.
Yeah, and not all companies will actually want the same kind of.
No, absolutely not. Like, for example, XAI, he's very clear that he doesn't want to focus on safety, right? He wants open, sort of unshackled AI. That's fine. It's good to have companies that are doing different things, which is also why you need state level regulation, right?
Right. And on Anthropic itself, there's two different initiatives that broadly stand out. So one is the constitutional AI, where they have set a set of principles by which they want to adhere to when they're building these AI models. And the second is their responsible scaling laws, where they say that as the capabilities of these models increase, the guardrails will also have to proportionately be stronger, so that higher risk models will have higher checks and balances to keep the risks within a certain acceptable range. So that's broadly about companies. The last area that we've looked at is on plurilateral bodies, where different groups of countries have come together and they're trying to form some sort of a consensus on how AI needs to be governed. And in some sense, using it as a platform to raise awareness about the risks of AI as they see it. So summits include the AI safety summits, like the one in Bletchley Park. There was one in Seoul the next year, and the recent one in Paris as well. So it's become an annual event uh, that's happening with these safety summits. And there's also the Global Partnership on AI, which India hosted last year. So all of these are kind of setting these broad. There's a lot of alignment on principles
across
amongst all
them.
of these
Yeah.
across these groups. So there's not too much of difference in how they're looking at it. But it's a good platform to still keep that debate going and highlight the concerns, so that companies or different states can also take cues from what is being discussed at these forums, right? Fora, right? So that's broadly what's going on with the plurilateral bodies. And maybe while there's all of this efforts going on, there's not too much of binding commitment or any such
Yeah.
kind of requirement yet from at these.
Yeah. Again, it's early days. I think the good news with the plurilateral bodies, all of these governance alliances, is that this is the one place where you have multiple stakeholders who can voice concerns around safety and social impact. And I imagine that let's say you want to talk about job impacts of AI. That's not just a regional thing, right? That's a kind of a global thing. Or if there are risks from uncontrolled AIs, that's a global conversation. Those, what are those risks and how do you manage them? So it's kind of good that we have so many alliances talking about roughly the same thing. I assume over time that they will sort of converge into one or two. I think a couple of them, like GPA and OECD, have already sort of started collaborating. So one would assume some of these will sort of merge into each other as we understand what risk and safety means, what accountability means in AI. But yeah, it's a useful thing to keep track of because we'll understand what the major concerns are across the world.
Right. So the last part of our report is also what we're ending with here, and that's the section on prediction. So it's a nice way to keep yourself also accountable, and you make a forecast of what you expect to see the coming year, and hopefully at least a few of those will turn out to be true, and then
Yeah, I
you can.
mean, and ideally, yes, we hope some of them are true, but it doesn't really matter if they're true or false. What will happen is if we are wrong about something, we'll try and analyze why we were wrong about it and what assumptions went wrong. Hopefully,
Right.
over time, we'll get better at making these predictions. So it's just an attempt at, like Bharath said, keeping ourselves honest and keeping ourselves accountable. And it's also fun.
Right.
What's the point of writing a report if you can't make predictions about it?
Right. So, any prediction that you want to highlight, so that listeners get a sneak peek at what we are talking about?
Okay, let's start with so one prediction that in the US is that especially given Trump's focus on innovation markets and his kind of lack of focus on risk and safety, we think that federal laws will not be focusing on AI risk and safety. So there is the NIST framework, which is a risk management framework, and I don't think it will be repealed. They'll let it be because it's not a mandatory standard. Outside of it, I think the federal laws will just focus on things like maybe the diffusion framework for chips. Maybe how do you help build infrastructure? Those that will be the focus of the federal laws. So the corollary to that, obviously, is that it will be the state laws, I think, in the US that will continue to drive for accountability and safety in AI. And I think it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. But I imagine that's how it will happen this year.
Right. So I'll add one more prediction. So the other thing that we were thinking is that when you look at the compute capacity that is being developed under the India mission, so we are predicting that a lot of that will be underutilized because so while it'll help incentivize some local compute capacity, and a lot of that will happen, but the way that it is being deployed, so the tendering process requires some compromises on maybe competing on quality of delivery, and also to avail the subsidy that is being offered. There's a 40% subsidy that is being offered by the government for these certain use cases. So if you want to avail that, there's also a very elaborate process by which you need to apply for it. Then even if you qualify for all of these criteria, you still there's a certain limit that you'll be allocated in a month, and then you'll have to wait for the next month to be able to use the next quota of thing. So it's a very bureaucratic process, and I guess it's a part of doing something like this in a public when the state has to be
Fair.
when the state is doing something, and then they need to be accountable in how these things are implemented.
Exactly. Yeah. And it's not just this, it's not like they built a supply and they've said that, the supply will adhere to market demand, right? That's not what they've done. They're controlling both sides of it. So even if you want to access this compute, like you were saying, there is an approval process, and obviously the same compute is available to researchers, academia, presumably startups and private players. So how do you decide allocation between that? All of that is going to be a bureaucratic process. It is definitely not going to be efficient. So yeah, and we're not saying necessarily that it will be underutilized, because there are two aspects to underutilize, right? We are saying it could be underutilized because there isn't demand. We hope that's not the case. What
Right.
we are most likely saying is that it will be underutilized because we'll have to figure out the kinks in all these approval processes, and it is never going to be as efficient as you want it to be. So, yeah.
Yeah. So this is what the report broadly talks about. And we hope to release it very soon. And keep an eye out on our social media pages and our website so that you can check it out when it's out.
Yeah.
So with that, any closing remarks, Rijesh?
Yes, please, we would love your feedback on the report, things that you liked, did not like, and we would certainly like you to remind us next year when our predictions fail, as they most likely will, and we'll come back to you with good explanations. So, and if you have some predictions you want to add to this, let us know. We'd at least love to know what you're thinking on these lines.
Right. On that note, thank you for listening, and we'll see you again in our next episode.
If you liked our show, dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs. Check us out at our Twitter handle @Takshashila INST or our website takshashila.org.in.